All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this Emerald Ash Borer informational meeting. Um, I'm Jonathan Ostis with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. I am the Emerald Ash Borer Technical Assistance Coordinator. I work in MDA's Plant Protection Division, and so I'm often a first point of contact for new detections of emerald ash borer throughout the state. So this meeting is being held due to the recent detection of emerald ash borer in Jackson County for the first time in the city of Jackson, and also for the new find in Lake County in the town of Silver Bay, a fair bit north of where it was previously found in Lake County in Two Harbors. And so the meeting is being recorded. I will make it available on our main MDA EAB webpage in the next few days after this. So if you know of someone who would benefit from listening to this presentation, please let them know it will be available. And I'll post that link on MDA's EAB webpage, and it'll also be available on YouTube. At any point, please feel free to put questions into the chat. It's just me this time around for these presentations. So usually I have somebody helping me with putting links and things like that as we go through. But feel free to put questions in the chat as we go along. I'll either address them as we go or wait till the end to address some of the questions, depending on what they are. And yeah, I am just going to kind of go through overall just kind of the life cycle of emerald ash borer, what the host trees are, is kind of the basics of emerald ash borer and why it's an issue, how to identify it, the known distribution in the state, and then I'm going to touch on the regulations associated with emerald ash borer, and then the management I'm going to touch on is basically for communities, individual trees, things like that, not necessarily forest level management. So I will also tell you how to best report new finds. So we really depend on knowledgeable people throughout the state to report things when they think they may have found it in a new location. So that's the gist of what I'm going to go through. And then I'll get started here with a little bit of background in case you're unaware of kind of the origins of emerald ash borer and the issue here in North America. All right, so emerald ash borer is a metallic wood-boring beetle. Its native range is Asia, so parts of China, Mongolia, the Russian Far East, North and South Korea, and Japan, Taiwan. And it likely arrived sometime in the early to mid 90s in North America into Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario area. And so it's thought that it was brought over via solid wood packaging materials into the ports there. And it wasn't identified as a problem until 2002. At that point, that population of the insect had kind of exploded, and they were starting to see kind of widespread ash mortality throughout that Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario area. And so lots of infested ash nursery stock and firewood had been moved around during that time before it was identified, kind of kicking off that rapid spread of the insect throughout North America. And so we find ourselves now at 38 states and 5 Canadian, or maybe 6 Canadian provinces now with emerald ash borer infestations. So it's throughout a good chunk of North America and the native range of ash. And it was first found in Minnesota in 2009. So it was found in St. Paul, Minnesota, and then quickly thereafter in Houston County, Minnesota, down the far southeastern part of the state. And now we have 53 counties out of our 87 counties with known emerald ash borer infestations throughout the state. There's likely more out there that just hasn't been reported or identified at this point. All right, so the life cycle of the insect. To better understand how you have to deal with it, it's good to know how the life cycle of the insect works. So emerald ash borer, we have what we consider the active period, so when the beetles are actively flying and moving around, and the inactive period, so when it's just the larvae kind of dormant underneath the bark of the tree. And so emerald ash borer beetles typically begin emergence sometime in May or June, kind of depending on where you are in the state and how quickly things warm up in the spring. We use growing degree days to measure when that emergence will initially occur, which is 450 growing degree days at a base temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And so just on average in the southern half of Minnesota, it's usually mid to late May that we reach initial emergence, and in northern Minnesota, it tends to be in early to mid June when we finally hit emergence. It kind of depends on how quickly things heat up in the springtime. And so once we reach initial emergence, the beetles begin emerging from the trees. Um, they do a little bit of maturation feeding in the canopy of the tree. So they do that for a few days. That's just them up in the canopy of the tree nibbling on leaves. They don't skeletonize the leaf or anything like that. So it's not something that's really a visible impact as far as canopy thinning and things like that when they're just feeding on the leaves. They do that for a few days, then they find a mate. Then the mated females will lay eggs in the bark cracks and crevices, starting in the mid to upper part of the canopy of the tree, and they work their way down. So when emerald ash borer is first infesting a tree, they begin in the mid to upper canopy in those branches, kind of between 2 to 6 inches in diameter, laying it where that bark has transitioned from smooth to rough. That's typically where they begin laying their eggs first. Um, Emerald ash borer beetles, female beetles, will typically lay anywhere between 60 and 90 eggs in their lifetime. The adult beetle itself lives on average, about 30 days, but upwards of 50. And so once they lay those eggs in the bark cracks and crevices, within a week or two, those eggs will hatch, and then those larvae will burrow through the bark and begin feeding in that cambium layer of the tree. So this is where it does the damage to the tree. It disrupts the flow of water and nutrients between the root system and the crown. And so the larva will then go through what we call 4 larval instar stages. It's basically just growing sizes. So they go through those growing sizes, and then they chew a pupal chamber, as you can see in that center picture right there, into the sapwood about a 1/4 inch, or on really large ash trees with thick bark, they'll do that into the bark as well. At this point, they're done tunneling and doing the damage that they're going to do to the tree. They fold over into what we call the J larva, as you can see in that picture there. From there, it'll pupate, turn into the adult beetle, and start the process all over again. So what I just described there is a 1-year life cycle. So we have both a 1-year and a 2-year life cycle in Minnesota. To give you an example of this, a 2-year life cycle is, say an emerald ash borer egg was laid in this summer of 2024. It made its way partway through its larval development, and it's going dormant for the winter. The summer of 2025, it will continue its larval development until it makes its way to its pupal chamber, and it'll overwinter a second time and emerge as an adult in the summer of 2026. So what that means is you can really have any immature larval stage under the bark at any time of year. And as far as 2-year life cycles go, the further north you go in the state, typically the more you have in that 2-year life cycle. It is somewhat density dependent on the tree as well, but on average, the farther north you are in the state, where you have colder temperatures, you have more of these insects in a 2-year life cycle. It's about 50-50 in the metro as far as 1 year to 2 year. And in far northern Minnesota, it's more like 80% in the 2-year life cycle. All right, so that's the life cycle of the insect. The beetles themselves can fly. They're okay flyers. They can fly up to 5 or 6 miles, but on average, they don't go very far from the tree that they emerge from. A good proportion of the beetles don't go more than 100 meters from the tree that they emerge from, but a small percentage of that population does strike out longer distance, and things like strong winds and whatnot can carry them even further. So, yeah, how emerald ash borer kills a tree. It's really the number of them that build up in a tree. A tree can withstand attack from a few beetles. It's really the number of larvae that end up feeding on the tree underneath the bark in that cambium layer and disrupting the flow of nutrients and water. So once you have a lot of eggs laid on a tree, it eventually girdles the tree and kills the tree. So you can go from a few emerald ash borer where the tree still looks really healthy to potentially thousands of emerald ash borer in a large ash tree and killing the tree. On average, it takes about 5 years to kill an ash tree from initial infestation to tree death. That can range depending on how big the emerald ash borer population intensity is in the area, the pest pressure. But on average, it's about 5 years. And so why this is an issue, the big issue that it is, populations grow slowly at first, especially if you have more of the insects in that 2 year life cycle. But eventually you hit this point at which those populations explode. And then within a couple of years of that population explosion, you have a lot of trees dying in a short amount of time. So even in our colder areas, it's still going to build to tree killing levels and cause a lot of tree mortality. And so this is what really causes a big issue for people that are managing a large number of trees in counties and in cities and things like that, where you have a large number of public trees that you need to manage. And so, once that population explodes, you really have to deal with a lot of dead trees in a short amount of time, and that can really break budgets. And so the earlier you find it and the earlier you start doing management, the longer you can push out that point at which you have that really mass tree mortality in that short amount of time, and spread out the expenses of dealing with those trees over a longer period of time. So the host trees for emerald ash borer is all true ash, and so ash trees have opposite branching. They have compound leaves. They have 5 to many leaflets. They have kind of that diamond ridge bark that you can see in these photos of the green ash along a boulevard. We have 3 types of ash trees that are native to Minnesota. We have black ash, green ash, and white ash. They are all highly susceptible to emerald ash borer, black ash being the most susceptible. So it takes the least amount of larvae per square meter of phloem to kill a black ash tree. And unfortunately, that's what we have the most of. So we have about 1 billion ash trees throughout the state of Minnesota. And so we are the lucky or unlucky state with the most ash in the lower 48. And so we really have a large resource that is under attack from this insect. A lot of that being in the black ash forest in northern Minnesota. Green ash is the most commonly one planted in yards and right-of-ways and parks and things like that, and windrows. That's found throughout the entire state. And we do have small pockets of white ash in parts of the eastern, more upland areas of the state. Like I said, these are all highly susceptible, and emerald ash borer will kill them. The only guaranteed way to protect an ash tree from emerald ash borer is treating individual trees with insecticide, and which I'll get more into closer to the end of this presentation. I will mention there is a secondary host. It is the white fringe tree. It is in the olive family. It is emerald ash borer can complete its life cycle in it. It's not a native tree or shrub to Minnesota, but occasionally you do find it planted in landscaped areas. I just mentioned this just in case you're looking for a new ornamental shrub to put in your yard or somewhere like that to avoid the white fringe tree. All right. So the best way to recognize emerald ash borer. So the number one way is finding. They make a very specific feeding shape. So they make this S-shaped feeding gallery when they're doing the tunneling underneath the bark in that cambium layer, and so they have kind of this distinct serpentine S back and forth shape that they create, and so you'll be able to find that in some point of the gallery for a larva underneath the bark, and that is really the number one way that we identify it. So if you find that S-shaped feeding gallery in an ash tree, it is emerald ash borer. It's the only insect in ash that will create that distinct S-shaped feeding gallery. Next is the larva itself. So if you happen to pull an emerald ash borer or an insect larva out of an ash tree, the way to identify if it's an emerald ash borer larva is that it will have those 2 little black pincers that's circled there in the photo on the right at the end of it. They're called the urogomphie. They're 2 little spine-like projections at the tail end of the larva. That is distinct for the genus Agarylus. So if you pull that out of an ash tree, you have emerald ash borer. And so the larvae typically have these creamy bell-shaped segments, and then you'll see those 2 little spine-like projections at the end. Of course, if you do find a larva, that you pull a larva out of an ash tree, you'll typically should be able to find that S-shaped feeding gallery on the surface of the bark as well. Emerald ash borer adult beetle is another way to identify it. It is distinct, and this is it's a less common way for it to be identified, but it does happen somewhat frequently, especially as populations continue to grow throughout the state. It is distinct looking, so it's about a ½ inch long by about an 1/8 inch wide. Has those bright iridescent green wing covers and that kind of deep magenta colored abdomen. So it is distinct, but there is a number of other green insects in Minnesota that are commonly confused and reported to us uh, as emerald ash borer. And then lastly, they do leave a D-shaped exit hole when they exit the tree. This is distinct, but I will say this is not one of the least good options for trying to identify emerald ash borer. Um, there's other insects that'll leave a oval shaped hole that can look kind of D-shaped. Um, it's in general, it's very hard to find. If you can see obvious D-shaped exit holes at eye level, if you were to look up in the tree, you should be able to identify a lot more symptoms that I'm going to talk about here momentarily that would let you know that this tree is infested. Because, like I mentioned, the beetle itself is about an 1/8 inch wide, so these are very small. If you're looking at a large tree with thick bark, that's very hard to identify. So really, you want to be looking for the beetle itself and these S-shaped feeding galleries that you'll find in damaged areas underneath the bark of the ash trees. All right, and then here's our kind of our handout on insects that are commonly confused with emerald ash borer. Really, the biggest one that gets confused with emerald ash borer is down in the bottom right there. It's the six-spotted tiger beetle. It's also kind of that bright iridescent green cover. It gets reported a lot in late May and through June. The ground nesting beetle, and a lot of times people will see it run across their deck or their sidewalk or something like that, and it catches their eye. Um, that's the most common misreported one. But as you can see up in the upper left corner, that's the emerald ash borer adult beetle circled there. You can see that it's that ½ inch long by about an 1/8 inch wide. All right. So signs and symptoms. Really, the number one thing that we use when we're looking for emerald ash borer infested ash trees is woodpecker damage. So unfortunately, we really rely on woodpeckers to help illuminate an area that is infested. Um, Emerald ash borer infestations are pretty cryptic in nature. It usually takes at least 2 years to see any sort of obvious signs in an ash tree that it may be infested. And if it was an otherwise healthy tree, oftentimes the canopy decline legs when you would actually see woodpecker damage first. So we do a lot of our survey for emerald ash borer throughout the winter months when there's no leaves on the tree. So this is the best time to be able to clearly look up into that mid canopy where emerald ash borer will initially begin laying its eggs. And so that's where we look for woodpecker damage. And when you get used to looking for this, it's got a kind of distinct look. Like I mentioned before, the emerald ash borer is laying eggs typically on those branches between 2 to 6 inches in diameter at first in that mid to upper canopy. And they typically lay them on the south or southwest facing side of the tree first. So the side of the tree that gets the most amount of direct sunlight. And then the woodpeckers, when they go after these mature larvae underneath the bark that they like to feed on, they'll usually do what we call blonding, where they'll kind of scuff off some of the outer bark, creating these little blonde patches. That creates something that can grab your attention, and then you're looking for these kind of dime size, light colored, oval shaped, shallow woodpeck holes that are going just deep enough to the surface of the wood to get to the emerald ash borer larva underneath. And so it ends up creating this pattern that can be somewhat easy to spot if you have a trained eye. And so you see these little light blonde patches up in the tree, and then you look for the actual woodpeck holes within those blonde patches. There's other things that can slough off bark, rubbing branches, squirrels running up and down a tree, things like that. So you always have to look for the actual woodpeck area within those blonded spots within a tree. Same thing for black ash. That center picture there is a black ash tree. It's not quite as pronounced just due to the color of the bark, where the green ash bark, there's more of a contrast between the color of the bark and then that blonding. It's a little more subtle in black ash, but that it is still there. And then you can see a heavily infested green ash tree in that picture on the right, where eventually you have woodpecker damage all the way down the trunk of the tree, basically down to the root flare, and then the bark will eventually start falling off as that tree is killed by emerald ash borer. So emerald ash borer is starting those branches in the mid upper canopy and working their way down. If you're trying to find it early, looking for that woodpecker damage in those key spots, on the southwest facing side of the tree. Oftentimes you can see a little bit of damage, especially in the wintertime, if you have a good pair of binoculars. And at that point, if before major canopy impacts would show up in the summertime, you may find it before that tree is too far gone, and it could potentially be saved with insecticide treatment. Other things to look for are the bark splits. So when emerald ash borer first infests a tree, that tree tries to heal around that feeding gallery wound. It builds up callus tissue around that feeding gallery, and then as that tree continues to grow, that bark separates from the surface of the wood and creates a nice vertical split. So you can see here 2 examples. They have, not all of them look the same, but there's some variety. But that's something that you can also look for, and you might find. I tend to see a lot of bark splits in black ash trees as well. And then here's a couple more examples of that. You can see the picture on the left. There's large vertical splits kind of going all the way up that main stem. And then in that picture on the right, if you look in the center of the photo at the very top, you can actually see there's a bark split, and you can actually see some of that S-shaped tunneling pattern on the surface of the wood within that split. So that's another thing to look for. But you have to be looking very closely because those aren't always very obvious. And then lastly, canopy thinning. So you will see canopy decline associated with emerald ash borer infestations. It's usually starting in the top of the tree. You get an overall thinning in the canopy. You get fewer leaves, smaller leaves, a lot more light penetrating through the canopy. And then oftentimes you really see that what that picture on the right shows is that really thinning canopy, and then you get a lot of sucker sprouts or epicormic sprouting along kind of the main stem lower down in the canopy, and it becomes real bushy and green and really thin on the outside. So that's a very common look to see in infested ash trees. But like I mentioned, if it was an otherwise healthy tree before emerald ash borer started attacking it, you're usually going to see woodpecker damage and canopy thinning woodpecker damage and bark splits before you start to see any major canopy thinning, especially for your average homeowner. They typically don't notice that something is wrong with their tree until it's too far gone and you're past the point of where treatment would be effective. And so this is the average progression of symptoms for emerald ash borer. Like I mentioned, on average, about 5 years for it to kill a tree from initial infestation point to tree death. That can take a little bit longer if it's kind of the first, the population hasn't really built up in the area, or it can go a little bit faster. It can kill a tree in as little as 3 to 4 years if you have a really high pest pressure in an area and emerald ash borer is kind of burning through the forest there. So, but on average, it's about 5 years. First year, you have small larvae present. There's no outward signs or symptoms on the tree that would let you know that emerald ash borer is present. Really, the only way you can reliably detect emerald ash borer in that first year of infestation is if you were doing what we call branch sampling. And that requires taking 2 3-foot sections of branch from the mid to upper canopy and peeling them with a draw knife to look for the immature larvae underneath the bark. So it's pretty labor intensive, and it still only gives you a 70-75% chance of detecting emerald ash borer in an asymptomatic tree. In that second year of infestation, you have more emerald ash borer building up in that tree. You might have, if the woodpeckers found that food source, you may start to see a little bit of woodpecker damage in that second year of infestation. It's really in that third year of infestation where you have more emerald ash borer building up in that tree year after year, where you're likely to see those bark splits and the woodpecker damage. You may start to have canopy thinning, but the average homeowner, you're not going to really see the major canopy impacts yet. It's really once you reach that year number 4 when it becomes pretty obvious that that tree has something wrong with it. And then, within that you have a year or two before that tree is completely dead. So once you really see obvious symptoms, there's not much time left for that tree. So really, it's typically about that year three cutoff range from when that tree goes from treatable to untreatable. Question online: do specific woodpeckers target IB? All woodpeckers will feed on it, so it's not really woodpecker specific. All right. So distribution of emerald ash borer in Minnesota. Like I mentioned, we have 53 counties now that have known emerald ash borer infestations. That's what we know of. There is almost certainly more out there. What I'm showing you right now is the Department of Agriculture's emerald ash borer status map. You can see the URL posted at the top there. This is a map that we keep current. It gets updated nightly with where we have confirmed emerald ash borer in the state. And so it also shows you the counties that are under emerald ash borer quarantine that restricts the movement of ash material in the emerald ash borer life stage and hardwood firewood, which I'll go into more in a moment here about what that means. But what's important here, if you think you have an emerald ash borer infestation, please check this map to see if you were already within a known infest area or not. And if not, please report and take pictures and let us know the exact location, which I'll tell you more about how to do best after this. But something else on this map that I'd like to really point out is we created a buffer around confirmed infested tree locations. So that's what we call the emerald ash borer generally infested area. And what that means is if you're within that generally infested area, there's a high probability that emerald ash borer is beginning to impact your ash trees, whether it's showing signs of infestation or not. So, once an area becomes infested, that distribution isn't, uniform. It's patchy, but eventually it coalesces into one really large infestation. And with it taking a couple years for symptoms to become visible, we know emerald ash borer is already beyond what we can physically see in the environment as far as damage goes. What we've seen in other parts of the state is, at least 1 to 2 mile spread rate a year. So that this buffer starts at 2 miles, and then as more stuff is identified in an area is closer to other areas that are infested, that buffer will expand out some. And so really just the take-home message, if you're within a generally infested area, there's a high probability your ash trees are already being impacted by emerald ash borer. You should be starting to make decisions now on how you want to deal with it. And if you're, in general, if you're within, 10 to 15 miles of a generally infested area, that's when you want to start thinking about whether you want to start doing treatment of your individual trees and things like that. As far as communities go, you never know when this will be identified in your community. You could be 50 miles from or 100 miles from a known infestation, but it could be identified tomorrow. So you really want to start planning and taking action now and coming up with management plans, having an ash inventory, things like that. So you're not really behind on the 8 ball, because once you have found it, it's already been there for a number of years, and the clock's ticking on dealing with all the ash trees in town. It can be a real burden. And so the longer you can spread out that work over more years, the better that's going to be on your budget and getting stuff replanted to refill that canopy. So yeah, that's the emerald ash borer status map. Please, it gets updated nightly. Check it frequently. It does change quite a bit with emerald ash borer now kind of moving pretty quick throughout the state. New finds. So the new detection in Jackson County was in the city of Jackson. County employee reported it, found an adult beetle, and so this isn't surprising. It's surrounded by other infested areas, and it doesn't show this on the map, but the areas in Iowa and Spirit Lake just below are all infested as well. This is very much likely an underrepresentation of what is going on in the area. So if you happen to find emerald ash borer in other areas throughout the county, please report that. It's just the underrepresentation is due to the inability to have the amount of time a surveyor would require to identify all the locations, and just the lack of reporting from property owners throughout the area. So just remember that there's likely a lot more going on, especially in the southwestern part of the state, than what we have recorded on this map. And if you zoom in, it's kind of right there, just south of I-90 where it was identified. So all of the, city of Jackson would be considered generally infested at this point, and is likely starting to be impacted by emerald ash borer. Next is the new find in Lake County. So you can see it's a little bit farther up the North Shore there, northeast of Two Harbors. It was found in the city of Silver Bay. Um, and so it was found, a few trees were identified by a DNR forester there. And so unfortunately with Silver Bay, most of their boulevard trees are ash. So it's going to have a very big impact in town right there. And it's going to require quite a bit of work going forward. Like I said, there's likely more going on. That's, a 20 some mile gap between Two Harbors and there. We know we have emerald ash borer on the other side of the Canadian border in Thunder Bay. There's likely more spots throughout the North Shore area where emerald ash borer is starting to take a hold. So please be on the lookout and report new locations if you come across them. All right. So regulations with emerald ash borer. What you just saw was on our emerald ash borer map kind of showed where those regulated areas are. And so the purpose of pest quarantines is to reduce or eliminate the spread of the pest through human assisted movement. And so what we're doing is restricting the material, the pest from being moved while trying to still facilitate normal trade. So that's the goal of a quarantine. We have both an internal quarantine, so the counties that have known emerald ash borer infestations in them are quarantined, and then we have an external quarantine limiting the movement of firewood, ash material from outstate or out of the country into Minnesota. So it is not allowed to be moved from North Dakota, South Dakota, Canada, Wisconsin, or Iowa, like things like hardwood, firewood, or any sort of ash material into the state unless it has a compliance agreement or and is certified safe to move. And so for Minnesota quarantines, the regulated articles, like I was mentioning, is all ash material. So that's any part of the ash tree, any emerald ash borer life stage, mulch, and all hardwood firewood. And so firewood is considered anything cut to 4 foot lengths or less. Once, whether it's split or not, once it's less than 4 feet, it's considered firewood, and it is regulated as such. So if you have maple logs that you'd like to move out of a quarantine area, if you can keep them in longer than 4 foot sections, they're free to move. But once they're less than 4 feet, they're considered firewood, and they're not allowed to move. The reason for this firewood rule is because the average person cannot tell the type of species of tree in a cut pile of firewood. Um, ash so often gets mixed in and people don't know for sure. So we have to be more general. And in general, it's really just a good rule to not move firewood long distances. Besides emerald ash borer, there's other insect pests and things that it could be spreading, and it's just a good change in culture to not move firewood long distances, to buy it where you're going to burn it. And so here's just a picture of the regulated articles that we're dealing with. And so the movement of these regulated articles. So we use this map with kind of the stoplight colors there. So with the red arrows, stop, you can't move it. You can't move that material from a quarantine county to a non-quarantine county. You can move freely that material within the quarantine area. So any adjacent counties that are all quarantined, you can move freely throughout that area. And you can move wood from a non-quarantine area into a quarantine area. But once it's within that quarantine area, it can no longer move out. The yellow area right there is for transiting. So if your origin point is a non-quarantine area and your destination point is another non-quarantine area, you can transit through the quarantine, just allowing for normal stops like getting gas or getting lunch and things like that. But you have to keep moving through that area. But yeah, and like it shows too, you can't move those regulated articles from outstate into the state. And so the only way to move those articles out of a quarantine area to a non-quarantine area requires a compliance agreement with the Department of Agriculture. And so there's a number of different treatment options. For mulch, it's chipping and grinding it, and it has to get down to 1 inch or less in 2 dimensions. So typically that takes a tub grinder. You can debark. So if you're using stuff for lumber and things like that, the complete removal of bark plus a 1/2 inch of sapwood. Compost, you got to reach 140 degrees for 4 days. Heat treatment, which is the most common one. We now have 12 or 13 certified firewood producers in the state for heat treatment. And those kilns are tested and made sure that the core temperature of the wood reaches 140 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 60 minutes. And that guarantees that any potential pest within the wood has been killed. And so those are free to move throughout the state and out of the quarantines, and are also free to move into places like state parks and whatnot. Where if it wasn't heat treated, other rules would apply as far as distance and how you can move into a state park. And then there's kiln dried lumber and fumigation. Those are all options, treatment options, if you're looking to move regulated articles out of a quarantine area. Like I mentioned, the definition of firewood, it's wood cut to lengths less than 4 feet long, whether it's split or not, whether it's for commercial or private use, and it's all species, all hardwood species. All right, and just to reiterate, firewood cannot enter from Canada or other states. It cannot leave the Emerald Ash Borer quarantine area or the Spongy Moth quarantine area, which is another quarantine we have in Lake and Cook counties in the northeastern part of the state. And firewood can move around inside adjacent pest quarantined areas. It can move around outside of the quarantine area, and it can move freely throughout the state if it's MDA certified. And so if you buy firewood and it has the MDA certified logo on it, it is safe to move, and there's no quarantine restrictions there. And and we continue to push the buy it where you burn it, just to reduce the opportunities for new pests being spread to new locations quicker and faster than they would be otherwise. The emergency quarantine that is now in place for Jackson and Lake County. If you have comments or questions, things like that, you can contact us here. Kimberly is the head of our regulatory department for that. So if you have questions, please feel free to direct them towards her. Otherwise, I can try to answer them as we go along here. And just reiterating, here's a piece of ash with no outward signs on the bark that there's anything wrong with it. You peel back the bark, you find an emerald ash borer gallery. Still, you don't see any bug. And then you dig in into the sapwood there, and you see that there's a J larva underneath in that pupal chamber, ready to pupate and emerge the next spring and summer, wherever that log ends up. So that's how it can move. You can have emerald ash borer emerging over a year after that wood was cut. So and there were studies that have been done over the years that showed you can have insects emerging from cut firewood, up to 2 or 3 years after that wood was cut. So getting in the practice of not moving firewood, this is why we've had this campaign for so many years now, and to buy it where you're going to burn it, and don't move firewood long distances. All right. So now I'm going to briefly touch on management. Like I said, this is mostly kind of city level management for more urban forests and things like that, individual trees and yards. Forest level management, you're going to want to reach out to your area DNR foresters. They're going to be able to help you identify, what would need to be done in your ash forest setting, and have better potential resources for you to do some of that work. So Emerald Ash Borer best management practices, we have that on our website. The active period for Emerald Ash Borer, like I mentioned earlier, is May 1st through September 30th. We have that date set up just to cover the entirety of the state and when it might be active. It's like it could be emerging in early May in the southern part of the state, but it really isn't going to be emerging likely until June. So that's why we have those kind of broader dates. And during that active period, if you can, you want to avoid doing ash removal, pruning, things like that. Moving ash material around when the beetle is actively flying. You don't want stuff, if the tree is, not showing any signs of infestation, and you're moving it during that active period, you're potentially having emerald ash borer emerge from that load of wood as it's being moved to wherever it's going to be processed or left. And like I mentioned, emerald ash will often reinfest the same tree or a tree right next to it. You would rather have it reinfest that same tree and remove it during that dormant period instead of having pushing those beetles that are up in the canopy out to new trees and out faster and helping spread that infestation quicker. So there's a few reasons there why you want to try to avoid doing it in the summertime when those beetles are flying around. Obviously, storms happen. You can't always adhere to things like that. Um, but at the very least, if you can leave the material on site, chip it up before you move it, or at the very least, cover your load as you move it to wherever it's going to be processed. That's ideal if you're doing it during that active period. And I do know in communities, once emerald ash borer, that population has exploded and you're starting to see rapid mortality, it may start to require doing year-round removal to keep up with the pace of removals once it reaches that point, just to deal with any potential hazards, because ash trees do fail rather quick, like fall apart rather quickly after they die and become quite hazardous. And that can increase the cost of removals as well. But if you can, try to do that removal and any pruning work during that dormant period, which is October 1st or April 30th. This way, you're not potentially moving wood that is harboring EAB and having stuff emerge, and you're not potentially pushing beetles out to new trees faster. And then you can also destroy that material during that inactive period. So whatever would emerge from that wood is destroyed, and removing a portion of that emerald ash borer population. All right. So when you're thinking about management, it really comes down to removals and treatments. With removals, you can remove ash trees before emerald ash borer has arrived. Trees you can have, if you're a community, you can and you have time to do a little bit of monitoring, you can identify trees that are showing the woodpecker damage, and then obviously dealing with dead trees as well. Before EAB arrives, if you're a community that has a really large percentage of ash populating streets, you might want to start removing the poor quality ash and start reducing that overall ash resource within the community, so that once it does arrive, you don't have as many trees that are then vulnerable to emerald ash borer, and start replacing them with a diverse number of species, just so we don't have these monocultures like we have currently in a number of communities. Unfortunately, after Dutch elm disease came through in the 70s and 80s, took out a lot of our city trees, those beautiful canopies. A lot of those were replaced with green ash, and now we're kind of suffering some of those same blights of having entire blocks of ash trees being taken out and losing all their canopy cover. So replanting with a diverse set of species. Obviously, it depends on where you're located in the state and what you might be able to do, but just making sure it's not a monoculture is really important, because this isn't the last pest that's going to come through and cause damage. So setting yourself up for a better outcome in the future is really ideal. Like I mentioned, you can look for trees. If emerald ash borer has been found in your community, identifying trees that show signs of infestation with that woodpecker damage, and then removing them in the wintertime and destroying that material. A tree showing signs of woodpecker damage compared to an asymptomatic tree right next to it is going to have a higher percentage of emerald ash borer within that tree. That was borne out by some work that was done in the metro with the U of M. And then obviously dead trees are hazardous. If they're in areas where they can damage persons or property, they need to be dealt with. Ash trees fall apart pretty quickly once they die, so that can really become hazardous quite quickly. And if you're a city that has to deal with them, that's something you have to mediate. So you want to deal with ash trees before they're completely dead, just to avoid that extra hazard. And it can, depending on where that tree is located in the yard, that can really increase the cost of removal. Especially we're finding out here in the Twin Cities, where emerald ash borer has been present for about 15 years. Ash trees in large ash trees in people's backyards. The tree care companies aren't going to climb those trees to piece it out. They have to bring in larger equipment, like cranes and things like that, and that can really spike the cost for removal quite a lot. So once emerald ash borer is in in your area, you really want to decide whether you're going to treat or remove, and then come up with a plan for that. You don't want to wait until that tree's completely dead, especially if it's close to your house or something like that, because it can really increase the cost of removal. We're seeing removal costs, anywhere from $7,000 to $10,000 for some backyard trees in the cities. So you want to deal with it before it gets to that point. And then treatments, those can be done preventatively and therapeutically. Insecticide treatments are not a one and done thing. They need to be reapplied either every year or every other year, depending on the chemical that's being used. And they can be trees can be treated before emerald ash borer is known to be there. So, and then it will protect it from emerald ash borer once it does arrive. Um, and then trees can also be treated after they're lightly infested. So the general rule of thumb, as long as there's no more than 30% canopy decline, so if you have at least 70% of a healthy canopy, that tree is still a good candidate to be treated, and it will be able to properly distribute the chemical throughout the tree and protect it from emerald ash borer. And so things you want to think about when you're deciding on removal or treatments is, how close is emerald ash borer known to be? Is it within 10 or 15 miles? Is it how healthy is your tree currently? How large is the tree? So how much would it cost to remove, or how long would it take to plant another tree and get it back up to the size where it'd be giving the same amount of shade and benefits? And then how many trees do you have to deal with? Those are all questions you want to think about when you're deciding on removal or treatment. On average, I'm seeing, around $10 a diameter inch to have trees professionally treated. That can vary a little bit depending where you are in the state and how many companies are offering those treatments. Um, it just kind of depends. There are many communities that contract with companies that may provide a discounted rate for doing those professional treatments. You always got to check with your community. And those are things that can be set up with tree care companies to provide that option to residents. And that way, the residents are having them properly treated instead of using the stuff that homeowners can buy at the local nursery store. So it just all depends. I've seen cities that are doing treatment programs that have gotten the cost of treating trees to under $5 a diameter inch. So it depends on the situation. A really large tree that gives you a lot of shade and is your main shade in your yard, it may be worth spending the money on treatment to keep that healthy and in place. And it could, treatment or removals can be very expensive too. So oftentimes you can treat a mature tree for at least 15 years before you reach what that removal cost would be if you had to hire a company. So those are all things you got to think about when you're deciding whether it's worth treating or just go ahead with removals. The insecticides, they're systemic. They affect adult beetles that feed on the leaves of the tree, and they also impact the larvae that are actively tunneling under the bark in the cambium layer. And so they get a dose in either spot. And so they are lethal trees. It's a good thing to use if you're a community that is managing a large number of trees that can help reduce populations in a localized area and make it take longer for emerald ash borer to build up to tree killing levels. So it's a good management strategy, helps you maintain canopy cover. You may not be planning to treat the tree for the life of the tree, but it could help you maintain canopy cover as you begin to remove more poor quality trees and start replanting and growing your canopy again. So it doesn't have to be something that you plan to do for the life of the tree. It could be something that helps you reach your goals to remove trees over a longer period of time, as opposed to having to remove a lot of trees within a short window of time without treatment. Something to remember for insecticide treatments, make sure you measure your tree. They need to be repeated, especially if you plan to do it yourself and use the homeowner options. The stuff for homeowners is typically a soil drench. Things like imidacloprid are typically what are used, or dinotefron, and those are applied via soil drench around the base of the tree. You got to really check the label and make sure that they're rated for the size tree that you're treating. Some of those products available to the average homeowner aren't rated for really large trees. So we really recommend, once your tree is at 12, 15 inches diameter at breast height, so at 4.5 feet above the ground, we really recommend you have them professionally treated And so professionals are going to use the trunk injection method, which uses the chemical emamectin benzoate, and that's injected right into the trunk of the tree and is uptaken. And so you're and is guaranteed for 2 years, where the soil drenches have to be reapplied every year. So if you have a large mature tree that you want to save, we really suggest that you have it professionally treated. Emamectin benzoate is a restricted use pesticide, so you do need to be a licensed pesticide applicator to apply it. And it requires some specialized equipment as well. So say you're a homeowner with a large number of ash trees on their property that they want to save, it might be worth it for you to invest in that equipment to do it yourself and get that um, uh, pesticide application license, but it kind of depends on the situation. For the average homeowner that's dealing with, maybe one or two trees that they want to deal with, if they're large and mature, please seek out a professional to do the treatment. All right, and so here's just kind of a picture to show you, like what that's what's treatable and what's not. So on that tree on the left, that's less than 10% canopy decline. That's a good candidate for treatment. Tree in the middle is between 10 and 30%. Still treatable. I mean, you're stopping things where it's at. It's not really going to come back from that, but it'll keep it from getting worse. So you got to keep that in mind too. If your tree is already somewhat infested, it's not going to be as full as it once was, even with the treatments. And then, once it's greater than 30% canopy decline, it's no longer a good candidate for treatment. All right. And also, it's just good to remember your management priorities change as you go from an uninfested area to a heavily infested area. So when you're in an uninfested area, you really want to be working on planning. So coming up with a management plan and thinking about budgeting for future work, because it will increase what you have to spend on your tree care budget in your community, and making sure you have an inventory, at least an ash inventory, but better to have an inventory of all your public trees that are on public property, because it's hard to come up with a plan and manage things if you don't know what the resource is. And so along with that planning and inventory, you want to be doing detection, paying attention, looking for infested trees, keeping an eye out, looking in the wintertime for that woodpecker damage, and reporting any possible infestations. Once you are in an infested area, you want to treat high value trees and try to keep up on that sanitation work. So doing the removals and destroying that material in a timely fashion, so you aren't left with a lot of dead trees that are hazards throughout your community. And then just minimize wood movement and safe disposal, and utilize that wood any way you can. If you're a community and you're grinding that wood up, you can use it as wood chips and new plantings throughout town, things like that, and just try to minimize infested wood movement out of the infested area. All right, and so other resources that are available. DNR Forestry has resources for Emerald Ash Borer as well. They have the DNR Forest Stewardship Program, and so they will advise private forest land owners on management for EAB. They have access to cost share programs dealing with things around Emerald Ash Borer management. And so please contact them if you're a private woodland owner and you have questions about that. And then we have the DNR Urban and Community Forestry Program resources that they've received a lot of money over the last number of years to grant out to communities. And so they do have financial assistance available in the form of grants for things like ash removals, replacements, boosting capacity within your town to do more forestry work. And so right now there's currently one grant opportunity that's open. It's called the Centering Communities and Canopy Solutions Grants. It's $1 million. You can get up to $100,000 in individual grants to a community. It's for areas that fall within their map on environmental justice. So a lack of resources funding communities with higher levels of poverty and things like that. So please go check that out and see if you could apply for that. So that can help really increase your capacity to do more management. Applications for that are due on October 28th. There's a number of meetings and webinars that they have set up talking about those grants. So if you would like to find out more information on that, please check that out. And there will be a round of the Relief Community Forestry grants that'll be available to communities at some time in the near future. The request for application date isn't open yet, but they're working on that. It'll be open at some point, likely this winter. You can see the URL below with how to access that information and the area community foresters map for that as well. All right, and just a reminder that reporting, we really depend on people reporting infestations. So there's a number of ways that you can report, but a couple of main ways to do it is by contacting MDA directly at the report a pest. So we have an email, we have an online form, we also have a voicemail that you can contact, and then also EdMaps. It's a great online, or you can download the app on your phone and you can report any terrestrial invasive species with this app. It's really convenient if you can do it that way. You create a report, it automatically takes the GPS location. Um, you can attach pictures, and then when you submit the report, it ends up directly in the correct identifier's email box. So if you're reporting emerald ash borer through EdMaps, I'm going to get alerted by email and can then follow up on it very easily with your contact information and the pictures you provided. But in general, please take pictures and make any notes of what you're seeing that makes you think it's emerald ash borer that's impacting the trees. If you see an insect, try to capture it or take a sample. If you capture a live insect, put it in a bag and throw it in the freezer. But pictures are really the most important thing here, and be very descriptive and accurate with the location that you're reporting it of. And yeah, and that's really depend on people actively reporting, because emerald ash borer is definitely in more locations throughout the state than what we have mapped at this point. All right, I'm going to go on to more questions now. Thank you again for attending this meeting. Yes, I'm going to put into the chat here the main ingredient that's used for insecticide use. We have a homeowner's guide to insecticide selection use. It is emamectin benzoate. So here's a link to that. There's a couple different, branded formulations. One's called Triage. Rainbow Science has their own version of it as well. And so if you look at the homeowner's guide to insecticide selection, it lays out the different chemical options, whether it's restricted use or not. And so it's a really helpful guide for that. Any other questions right now? Well, once again, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us this morning for the Emerald Ash Borer informational meeting. If you have any questions at any point in the future, my contact information is up there on the screen. Please feel free to reach out. So here, so all of our outreach links are available on our website at the EAB info for homeowners. We have kind of the how you identify it. We have the homeowner's guide to insecticide selection. We have emerald ash borer management guidelines, things like that when you're trying to reduce emerald ash borer populations and communities. Tips on how to hire a tree care professional, things like that are all available at that link. And just in case you don't have it, I'm going to provide the link to our EAB status map. And like I mentioned, please feel free to reach out to me by phone or email at any point in the future. Happy to chat and answer any questions you might have that come up.